Okay, so for this lesson, we are on part 2 of inverse trig functions. So remembering our chart from yesterday, I'm just going to relist my domain for all of these. So we have arc sine, we have arc cosine, and we have arc tangent. Arc sine went from negative pi over 2 to pi over 2. Arc cosine went from 0 to pi. And arc tangent went from negative pi over 2 to pi over 2. So we're still going to use those today. So you can reference back to the chart or you can write it down on the side like I did here. So let's start with number 1. Number 1, we have the tangent of an arctangent of negative 5. So what happens when you have an inverse and the original function is they cancel out. Inverse means opposite. So as long as negative 5 is an answer in our domain, which negative 5, if you remember, tangent goes from negative infinity to positive infinity, negative 5 would be an answer that would work. We are all set. So let's take a look at number 2. Arc sine and sine, they would cancel. So 5 pi over 3, as long as that's an answer in our interval, then we're good to go. So let's take a look at 5 pi over 3. If you pull out your unit circle, let's find where 5 pi over 3 is. Okay, 5 pi over 3 is down here at the bottom at 300 degrees. And we're doing sine. So sine goes from negative pi over 2 to pi over 2. So 5 pi over 3 is in that section. I just don't want to label it that because it has to be either a positive number between 0 and pi over 2 or a negative number between 0 and negative pi over 2. So 5 pi over 3, instead of calling it 5 pi over 3, I'm going to call it negative, and it's in the same spot as pi over 3. It's just down below. So it's going to be negative pi over 3. Okay, so now let's look at number 3. We have cosine of inverse cosine of pi. They cancel. We're left with pi. And I'm going to check. Cosine goes from 0 to pi. So it looks like that would be okay. But technically, it's right at an endpoint. So if we remember like what the cosine graph looked like, the inverse one, it looked like this. Right at pi, it was up at the top. So technically, right at the end point is a spot where it would not pass the vertical line test. So technically at endpoints, we're not going to count those. So what we would say is does not exist. Now for all of these, we could check these on our calculator. If I check number 3, I could plug it in exactly how I see it. So cosine and then inverse cosine of pi. And I got an error. Back to number 2, if I type that one in, inverse sine of 5 pi over 3. I got a negative number. So I didn't get the 5 pi over 3, I got the negative number. And I bet if I plug in negative pi over 3, and I check that, I get the same exact answer. So negative pi over 3 was in fact the answer for number 2. Okay, there's a couple other ways that you could get asked inverse questions. So flipping to the back of the worksheet, this time we're going to get some answers that aren't angles. So we have the tangent of arc cosine of 2/3. So if I don't have an angle, what I can do instead is use a right triangle to help us out. So I'm going to set up a right triangle, and I'm going to label this as my angle that I'm going to use, the one on the bottom. It doesn't matter. You could pick the one on the top too. And I'm going to figure out some sides, hopefully. So we're looking for the angle that gives us a cosine of 2/3. So I would know 2 of those sides. Cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. So I'm going to label the adjacent side 2 and the hypotenuse 3. And I'm going to solve for the other side. So I know that. So I'm going to use the Pythagorean theorem. 2 squared plus b squared equals 3 squared. That gives me 4 plus b squared equals 9. So b squared would equal 5. This missing side would be root 5. Okay, so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be finding the tangent of that same angle. So basically we're using the inside to solve a triangle so I can figure out the outside. Kind of like when you guys did PEMDAS back in Algebra 1 and you had a lot of parentheses, you would always start with the innermost parentheses first and work your way to the outside. It's the same concept. So I'm going to find the tangent of our angle. So tangent is opposite over adjacent. So the opposite side is root 5. The adjacent side is 2. Now, if you want to check your work, you can use your calculator. So you're going to type in the original problem, tangent arc cosine of 2/3. So tangent arc cosine of 2/3. And I get a decimal, 1.118. Now, if I want to check my answer, I'm going to type in root 5 over 2, and I should get the same decimal if I did it right. Root 5 divided by 2, and I get the same decimal. So that's a great way to check your answer to make sure you're on the right track. Okay, let's try another one. So let's go to number 5. We have the cosine arc sine of -3/5. So this is not a unit circle question because that's not an angle. So I'm going to work with a right triangle instead. So here we have arc sine, and sine is opposite over hypotenuse. So here we have a negative side. So this must not be a triangle in the first quadrant. So I'm going to label my opposite side -3. The hypotenuse is 5. Hypotenuse is actually always positive, right? Because you're squaring two numbers and adding them to get the hypotenuse. Okay, so now arc sine exists in the first and fourth quadrant. So I must be dealing with a fourth quadrant triangle if I have a negative side. So I'm going to find the other side of this triangle. Now I know this is a Pythagorean triple. This is a 3, 4, 5. So I'm going to label this side 4. So technically, if I want to draw the triangle correctly, it would be in the fourth quadrant. It would look like this. Here's my angle. Hypotenuse is 5. Opposite is -3. And then here's my missing side of 4. So 4 is positive because we get to the fourth quadrant, we go to the right and then down. So 4 would be positive. So now I'm ready to solve. I'm going to solve for the outside part. I'm going to find the cosine of that angle. So cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. So I'm going to be solving. I'm going to be plugging in. So adjacent is 4. Hypotenuse is 5. And there's our final answer. So we just did 3 questions on the front where we were given angles and we had to use inverses to solve, and then the ones on the back here were given the answers and we have to find the outside function. So there's a couple different ways that you can use inverses to solve. Okay, so that's the end of part 2. So we've now completed the first section of we completed the section of inverse trig functions. So there's a part 1 and part 2, so make sure you've watched both sections.